Right. So today we're going to take a deep dive into something pretty fascinating, and that is the way radiologists, technologists, and patients communicate, especially when we're talking about things like imaging procedures,
Mm-hmm.
the reports that come out of those, and then ultimately the findings.
Ah, yeah.
It's super important stuff, and I think everyone listening knows someone or maybe has even themselves gone through the experience of having to sort of muddle through this.
Absolutely.
So that's what we're going to try to do today is like really equip you with a good understanding of what's going on in that
Yeah.
communication.
Yeah. And I think it's worth pointing out, our source material really emphasizes that it is a dialogue. It's not just a one-way flow of information.
Yeah.
There's a lot of back and forth, and it's really important to understand those nuances because
Yeah.
that's often where those misunderstandings can arise.
I mean, it makes me think of that game of telephone that we used to play as kids,
Oh, yeah.
where you start out with one message, and by the time it gets to the end of the line, it's something completely different.
Right. Right. Exactly. And the problem is, in radiology, the stakes are a little bit higher
Right.
than a silly game,
In a silly game, right?
Misinterpreting information could have a real impact on someone's diagnosis, their care, all these kinds of things.
Yeah, and one of the things the source mentions, too, is interpreting radiology reports.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
And how that can be,
Huge.
well, kind of a point where things go sideways.
Absolutely. I mean, have you ever tried to read one of those things? They're full of jargon.
No, they're dense.
They're dense. There's a lot of terminology that just doesn't make sense to the average person.
Like, what's a hyper-intense lesion,
Exactly right. Like you get a report and it says, there is a hyper-intense lesion with irregular margins in the left parietal lobe.
Oh, my God.
You're like, what does that even mean?
I need to call you right now.
Right, exactly. But what it really means is there's a bright spot on the scan, which is the hyperintense lesion, and it has like blurry edges, which is the irregular margins. And it's in a particular part of the brain, the left parietal lobe.
Right.
And that could be anything. It could be a benign cyst. It could be something more serious. And so if the radiologist doesn't take the time to kind of translate that into language that the patient can understand,
Right.
that's where the problem starts.
Well, and it's not just about simplifying the language either. It's about
Sure.
connecting those findings to the person,
No.
right? To their actual symptoms, their health history, and putting it all in context.
Absolutely. I mean, that same hyperintense lesion, let's say, might mean something totally different for someone who has a history of multiple sclerosis
Right.
than for someone who's never had any neurological problems.
Right. Completely different.
It's all about context.
So, it's almost like the radiologist is kind of like a detective in a way, piecing together
Oh, yeah, 100%.
the clues
Yeah.
from the images and for the patient's story. And the source also mentioned that this whole communicating findings effectively, really clearly isn't just about between the radiologist and the patient,
Right.
but it's also between the radiologist and the technologist.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just like a detective needs to communicate with, their forensic team or whoever else is helping them gather information.
Right.
The radiologist has to be able to communicate effectively with the technologist.
So what would that look like in a real world example?
Well, let's say a patient comes in and they have abdominal pain, and the radiologist is suspecting it might be appendicitis, but they need a very specific kind of image to really confirm that.
Okay.
So they might say to the technologist, we really need to focus on the right lower quadrant, and we need to get both transverse and longitudinal views to properly assess the appendix.
Right.
So they're giving them those very specific details so the technologist knows exactly what images to capture.
That makes sense because without that communication, they could be missing. They might not capture the right image.
Exactly. They might miss the key piece of information that they need for the diagnosis.
And there was even an example in the source material about how this can really go wrong.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
Where the technologist positioned a patient a certain way for a chest x-ray.
Oh, right.
Because they weren't on the same page about what the suspected diagnosis was,
Right.
the images didn't clearly show a small lung nodule, which later turned out to be cancerous.
Oh, yeah. And that's scary because, early detection in these cases is so important.
Absolutely.
So, that miscommunication really had an impact on that patient's care.
Yeah. So it really highlights how even what might seem like a small communication gap
Yeah.
can actually end up having huge consequences.
Absolutely.
And so it's really about that open dialogue between everyone, the radiologist, the technologist, and of course the patient.
It's like they're all part of the same team
Yeah.
working towards the same goal.
So we're wrapping up our deep dive here, and I think it's clear that this whole idea of communicating effectively in the field of radiology, it's complex.
Yeah, it's multifaceted for sure.
It requires, a lot of attention and consideration at every stage.
Yeah, and I think the main takeaway for me is that it's so powerful when it's done well.
Right.
It can literally be life-changing for people.
Absolutely.
And it really kind of makes me wonder, how can we empower patients to be more active in their own care? Asking those clarifying questions, really advocating for themselves in what can sometimes be a really complex and intimidating conversation.
Right.
What do you think, what kind of strategies would you suggest for radiologists and technologists to really make sure that their patients truly understand their care and feel heard?
It's a great question and something for everyone to think about.